We have an absolutely massive, completely fascinating mission for this deep dive today.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It really is. I mean, if you've ever found yourself wondering why you just reacted a certain way to a random text message, or why you keep repeating the exact same patterns in your relationships over and over.
Or even why a specific smell suddenly makes you feel a profound sense of dread.
Exactly. If any of that resonates, you are in the right place. We are exploring an incredible stack of lectures that basically chart the entire modern evolution of psychological thought.
The whole grand search for the why of human behavior.
Right. We're going to decode exactly how the human mind works. It's a journey that starts in the dark, hidden depths of Sigmund Freud's unconscious mind and then swings wildly over to the behaviorists.
Who completely rejected all of that unseen stuff.
Yeah, strictly observable actions for them. And then we finally arrive at the cognitive revolution, which proves that the specific way you process thoughts actually shapes your physical reality.
It is a sweeping historical narrative, really. We're looking at how different generations of brilliant, highly determined scientists and clinicians tried to answer the exact same fundamental question.
Why do we do the things we do?
Right. And the paradigms they built to answer that question couldn't be more fundamentally opposed to one another. Each movement essentially looked at the previous one and said, you have completely misunderstood what it means to be human.
And the practical applications of these theories are just wild. Just to give you a sense of what we are going to cover today, we will look at how a hidden conditioned fear of a little white rat can somehow mutate into sheer terror of a Santa Claus mask.
A classic case.
We're also going to break down why punishing your cat for running away might be backfiring on you completely due to a total misunderstanding of behavioral timing.
That's a mistake so many people make.
And we'll even explore how the specific, momentary way you interpret a bad day at the office could literally predict your long-term physical health and lifespan. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start right at the beginning of modern psychology, plunging into those hidden forces. We are talking about psychoanalysis, the unconscious mind, and, of course, Freud.
You really can't discuss the architecture of the mind without starting with Freud. The foundational idea here, which we just take for granted now but was completely earth-shattering at the time, is that our conscious mind is just the tip of the iceberg.
Just a tiny fraction.
Right. The part of you that is listening to this deep dive right now, the part making active decisions and thinking in linear words, is a tiny fraction of your mental real estate. Freud argued that the vast majority of our mental life, our deepest motives, our fears, particularly our sexual and aggressive drives, they're submerged deep underwater.
Completely unconscious. Which presents a massive problem if you are a therapist trying to help someone. You can't just ask a patient why they're having panic attacks or why they keep actively sabotaging their own career.
Because they genuinely don't know.
The conscious mind is locked out of the server room. So you have to look for clues, right? You have to interpret the weird, distorted signals that occasionally bubble up from the deep.
Precisely. And in the psychoanalytic tradition, one of the most potent ways to gather those clues is through dreams. Dreams are where the conscious guard is lowered and the unconscious mind starts to project its raw material, albeit disguised in really heavy symbolism.
There is an incredibly vivid clinical example of this in the materials, right?
Oh, yes. A man comes to a psychoanalyst and describes a highly disturbing, bizarre dream. In this dream, the man is standing up on a high, rocky cliff. He's holding a fishing rod, and he is casting his line way down into this intensely polluted, filthy, murky water.
Ugh, nasty.
Very. Eventually he gets a bite and he pulls up this decaying, rotten, absolutely disgusting fish.
It's such a visceral image.
It is. But the dream doesn't stop there. As he's standing there holding this rotting fish, he looks down and notices that there are women willingly swimming around in this highly polluted water.
Just swimming in the filth.
Yeah. And at some point, the water level rises or he shifts his position and he ends up getting his feet slightly wet in it. And then the final looming image way off in the distance, slowly swimming toward the shore, is a massive sperm whale.
Okay, if a friend told you that dream over coffee, you would probably just laugh and tell them they shouldn't have eaten spicy food before bed.
Right, it's on the complete random static.
But to a psychoanalyst, there is no such thing as random static. Every single element, every bizarre detail, is a highly specific piece of encrypted data.
What's fascinating here is the exact methodology they use to decrypt it. They use a technique called free association. The therapist doesn't pull out a standardized dream dictionary and declare that a decaying fish means bad luck is coming.
Which is what everyone assumes dream interpretation is.
Exactly, it's a huge misconception. The symbols are entirely subjective. They're uniquely authored by the dreamer's own mind. So the therapist isolates each variable of the dream and asks the patient to just say whatever comes to mind without any conscious censorship.
To trace that invisible network.
Right, tracing the associations in the patient's brain, following the thread from the symbol back to the hidden conflict.
So let's look at how that actually plays out with this specific patient. They start with the fishing rod. Through free association, the rod or the pole quickly connects to phallic imagery. Then they move to the polluted water.
And the therapist asks the man to associate freely about filth and pollution.
Right. And it emerges that this man was an only child raised in an intensely rigid, strictly Orthodox Catholic environment. Over his childhood, he had internalized this profound, unshakable belief that sexuality was inherently dirty, polluted, and morally taboo.
He even harbored this deeply buried childhood fantasy, or fear really, that his own birth had somehow physically damaged his mother, rendering her unable to have any more children. So in his unconscious mind, the very act of sex is inextricably linked to destruction, damage, and filth.
That perfectly explains the polluted water. And he's standing above it, fishing in it, and he pulls up this decaying fish. The fish represents the profound guilt and the sense of rot he associates with his own sexual impulses.
But then you have the women swimming in the water.
Right. Through the free association, the man expresses sheer bafflement at the dream image. He cannot fathom why any woman would willingly immerse herself in something so disgusting.
Which directly mirrors what is happening in his waking life. He has recently started dating a woman, and they are just beginning to get physically intimate. In the dream, he gets his feet wet, which is a direct metaphor for tentatively stepping into the sexual relationship.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
And his conscious bafflement in the dream reflects his unconscious shock in reality. He cannot understand why this woman is willingly engaging in physical intimacy with him because his schema dictates that intimacy is a polluting, degrading act.
And then we get to the whale. A sperm whale, of all things, approaching from the distance, spouting water. Again, heavily phallic, incredibly imposing. The therapist asks him to freely associate about the whale. The man brings up the biblical story of Jonah being swallowed by the whale.
Right, the engulfment fear.
He realizes he is absolutely terrified of being engulfed, of losing his identity and being swallowed whole by this new romantic relationship. But there's a second layer to the association, too.
Yes, he connects the massive, monolithic, imposing nature of the whale to the Catholic Church itself. It's this giant institution looming on the horizon, slowly approaching to swallow him up in moral guilt for his sexual transgressions.
It is a stunning example of how the mind constructs highly elaborate, multi-layered metaphors to express conflicting desires and terrors simultaneously.
It really is.
But as compelling as that narrative is, it invites a very sharp, very valid criticism. The interpretation feels almost too neat, too literary. How do we know the analyst isn't just leading the witness?
How do we know they aren't projecting their own theories onto the patient's random brain misfires?
More fundamentally, how do we know this vast, hidden unconscious even exists in a scientifically measurable way?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's one thing to interpret a dream, it's another to prove the machinery is actually running in the dark. And that is exactly what researchers set out to do. We have to look at the experimental evidence for the unconscious.
Let's start with unconscious thought. There's a brilliant spelling experiment in the sources that completely isolates how our brains process information without our permission.
Beautifully elegant study. You bring subjects into a lab and you give them a highly demanding conscious task. For example, you have them count backward from 100 to 0 out loud by sevens.
That's hard enough on its own.
Exactly. It requires a lot of cognitive bandwidth. Their conscious attention is fully occupied. While they are doing this, you expose them to a list of word pairs that they are told to memorize. One of those word pairs happens to be taxi and cab.
So they are distracted, trying to do math, trying to memorize words. Later on in the study, you give them a completely different task. You just ask them to spell out a sound. You ask them to spell the word fair.
Now, statistically, if you just walk up to a random person on the street and ask them to spell that sound, the vast majority will spell it F-A-I-R, like a county fair or a fair weather friend.
It's the most common usage.
But the subjects who were exposed to the words taxi and cab, even though they were highly distracted at the time, overwhelmingly spell it F-A-R-E, like paying a taxi fare.
Their brain had unconsciously activated an entire semantic network.
Yes. The concept of a taxi was primed, and that priming reached out and activated related concepts, including fare. It shifted their physical behavior, how they chose to spell a word, without them ever making a conscious, deliberate choice.
But a skeptic might say, well, they still consciously read the word taxi, even if they were distracted.
So researchers took it a step further with dichotic listening tests.
Right. Imagine you are wearing a pair of headphones. In your right ear, someone is reading a complex story, and you are instructed to repeat every single word of that story out loud as you hear it. It's called shadowing, and it is incredibly difficult.
You have to focus 100% of your attention on that right ear.
Meanwhile, in your left ear, a completely different list of words is being played. You are so focused on the right ear that if the researcher stopped the tape and asked what was playing in your left ear, you genuinely have no idea. You didn't hear a thing.
Your conscious mind did not register the audio, but during the test, the researchers played the word taxi into that ignored left ear. And when they later asked those subjects to spell the sound fare, they still spell it F-A-R-E.
That's wild.
The auditory cortex heard the sound, the language centers processed the meaning, the semantic network was primed, and the spelling behavior was altered. All while the conscious mind was completely blind to the entire process. It is hard proof of complex, unconscious cognitive processing.
Which is mind-blowing enough. But then we move from unconscious thought to unconscious emotion. And the evidence here centers around one of the most famous and, frankly, tragic cases in medical history.
Patient HM.
Right. HM suffered from deeply debilitating, life-threatening epilepsy. To save his life, surgeons went in and removed specific parts of his medial temporal lobe, most notably the hippocampus on both sides of his brain.
At the time, they didn't fully understand the precise function of the hippocampus. They quickly found out.
Yeah. The surgery successfully cured his epilepsy, but it completely destroyed his ability to form new conscious memories.
HM was permanently marooned in the present tense. If a doctor walked into his room, introduced himself, chatted for 20 minutes, then left the room and walked back in 5 minutes later, HM would have absolutely zero recollection of ever meeting the man. He had to be reintroduced every single time, every single day, for the rest of his life.
Which sets the stage for this deeply profound moment regarding human emotion that the materials talk about. At one point, HM's father passed away. The hospital staff had to break the news to him. When he was told, HM reacted exactly how you would expect any loving son to react. He was devastated. He wept bitterly. He experienced profound, acute grief.
But because of his missing hippocampus, the moment his attention was diverted, maybe he went to eat lunch or watch television, that conscious memory of his father's death completely evaporated.
If you walked up to him 20 minutes later and asked HM, how is your father doing? He would calmly reply, oh, he's doing fine. I think he's at work. He consciously believed his father was alive and well.
But, and this is where the power of the unconscious reveals itself, if you stayed with HM and observed him after that conscious memory faded, you would notice something heartbreaking. His demeanor would darken. He would become deeply agitated and express this vague, lingering, heavy sense of emotional dread.
He would tell the nurses that he just felt like something terrible had happened.
Or that he had a dark feeling about his father, even though he couldn't point to a single conscious reason why.
The emotional resonance was trapped in his nervous system.
Exactly. The amygdala and other emotional processing centers of his brain were still largely intact. His body remembered the grief, his neurochemistry was actively experiencing the grief, but it was entirely decoupled from the conscious narrative.
He was feeling profound sorrow without knowing the reason for the sorrow.
It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that an emotion does not require conscious awareness to be acutely felt and experienced by the body.
And we actually experience a milder version of this all the time, don't we? The mere exposure effect.
Oh, absolutely.
You take that same dichotic listening setup we talked about, the headphones where you completely ignore the left ear. Researchers play sequences of musical tones into that ignored ear. You have no conscious memory of ever hearing those tones. But later, they sit you down, play a variety of different musical sequences, and ask you to rate which ones you like the best.
People consistently, statistically prefer the music they were unconsciously exposed to.
The brain processes the familiarity and translates that hidden familiarity into a conscious feeling of preference. We just assume we have a natural taste for that melody, completely unaware that the preference was artificially planted in the dark.
Which brings us to perhaps the most controversial and consequential layer: unconscious motivation. We've established the brain can think without us knowing and feel without us knowing. But can it actively drive our behavior or force us to defend ourselves without our conscious permission?
There is a highly revealing study by a psychologist named Jonathan Shedler exploring the concept of illusory mental health.
Shedler hypothesized that the standard way psychology measures anxiety, which is just handing someone a questionnaire and asking, on a scale of 1 to 5, how anxious are you? He thought that was fundamentally flawed.
Because it relies on the person actually knowing and admitting how they feel.
Precisely. Shedler argued that many people utilize unconscious defense mechanisms to completely deny their own distress. They don't want to view themselves as anxious or broken, so their conscious mind literally blocks the anxiety from their awareness. They fill out the questionnaire and honestly score themselves as having supreme, perfect mental health.
So Shedler takes a large group of these people, the ones who self-report zero anxiety, zero neuroticism, but then he throws a curveball. He asks them to write out in detail their earliest childhood memories.
And he takes these written narratives and hands them over to an independent clinical psychoanalyst who has no idea how these people scored on the questionnaire.
The analyst evaluates the early memories strictly for their psychological structure. Are the memories populated by benevolent, safe figures, or are they chaotic? Are the outcomes of the stories triumphant, or do they end in sudden, unexplained trauma?
Based purely on these early narratives, the psychoanalyst identifies a distinct subgroup within the perfectly healthy individuals and flags them. The analyst says these specific people are not healthy. Their core narratives reveal deep, unresolved psychological conflicts and pervasive underlying anxiety. They are highly defensive.
So now you have a massive contradiction. The conscious self-report says, I am an absolute Zen master, perfectly fine. The clinical evaluation of their unconscious narrative says, this person is hanging on by a thread. Who is right?
To find out, Shedler brings them into the lab and puts them through a high-stress psychological gauntlet. He gives them incredibly difficult timed cognitive tests like impossible mental arithmetic, and he hooks them up to medical equipment measuring their cardiovascular reactivity, heart rate, and blood pressure.
And the physiological data was undeniable.
Completely undeniable. The people who the psychoanalyst flagged as defensive, the ones who claimed to be perfectly fine, exhibited cardiovascular stress reactions that were completely off the charts. Their blood pressure spiked violently, their heart rate skyrocketed.
Furthermore, Shedler had independent, blind coders listen to the audio recordings of these people speaking during the stressful tasks. The coders noted that this specific group was constantly sighing, stammering, and experiencing verbal blocks. Their bodies and their speech patterns were screaming in panic.
But, and this is the absolute kicker, when Shedler stopped the stressful task and immediately handed them another questionnaire asking, how anxious do you feel right now? They still reported feeling the lowest levels of anxiety in the entire study.
That is wild.
Their conscious mind's need to deny the anxiety was so powerful, so motivated, that it completely severed their awareness from their own physical reality. They were defensively denying the stress, but their cardiovascular system was absorbing the full violent impact of it. It is a terrifying thought when you extrapolate that out over a lifetime of stress.
It's the physical cost of keeping the secrets locked in the basement. And if we look at how early these unconscious blueprints are drawn, the data becomes even more startling. The materials discuss the profound disconnect between explicit motives and implicit motives.
Right. Explicit motives are what you consciously claim to value. I want to be a good team player. I value equality. You measure this with the survey. Implicit motives are your unconscious drives. You measure these indirectly, often using something called the thematic apperception test, or TT.
You show someone an ambiguous picture, say two people standing in a room, and ask them to write a story about what is happening. The way they structure the story, the themes of dominance, submission, or achievement they inject into the blank canvas, reveals their implicit, hidden drives.
And the research shows almost zero correlation between what people explicitly say they want and what their implicit stories reveal they actually crave.
But where do those implicit drives come from? The source material highlights a staggering longitudinal study. They measured the implicit need for power, the unconscious drive to dominate others, to have an impact, to be in control, in adults who were 40 years old. And they found a significant correlation between that 40-year-old's drive for power and the severity of the toilet training they received when they were 2 years old.
It sounds almost like a parody of Freud, doesn't it?
It really does.
But the empirical data supports the connection. The theory is that toilet training is often a child's first major, protracted battle of wills with an authority figure. It happens during a critical window of neurodevelopment, entirely in the realm of nonverbal emotional learning.
If the parents are rigid, severe, and punitive during this phase, the child internalizes a profound pre-verbal lesson. The world is a hierarchy of absolute control, and you are either the one dominating or you are the one being dominated and shamed.
So you internalize that emotional blueprint. Fast forward nearly 4 decades. You are sitting in a boardroom. You don't consciously think, I must aggressively crush my corporate rivals and assert total dominance over this merger because my mother was incredibly harsh about my potty accidents in 1985.
Of course you don't. Consciously, you think you are just implementing good business strategy.
But the engine driving the intensity of your behavior, the raw fuel of that ambition, was refined before you even had the vocabulary to describe it.
Exactly. And this causes immense internal friction. A person might grow up and consciously endorse highly egalitarian values. They might explicitly believe that a marriage should be a perfect 50-50 partnership, and they will swear on a survey that they intend to split all household chores equally.
But their implicit motives were forged in a childhood environment where they observed a highly traditional, rigid division of labor. Because their implicit motives run on an automated, unconscious track, they will constantly find their actual behavior defaulting to that old blueprint. They have to actively, consciously fight their own nervous system to align their behavior with their conscious beliefs.
So what does this all mean for the internal mechanics of our minds? If we have these ancient, nonverbal drives clashing with our conscious, civilized values, how does the brain prevent itself from tearing apart? How's this managed?
That takes us directly into Freud's famous structural model of the mind and the brilliant concept of defense mechanisms. Freud looked at all this hidden conflict and realized there had to be an internal architecture managing the traffic. He divided the psyche into 3 interacting systems.
The id, ego, and superego.
First, you have the id. In German, Freud originally just called it the is, or the it. The id is the oldest, most primitive part of our biology. It is the seat of our raw instincts, primarily our sexual and aggressive drives.
The id operates entirely on the pleasure principle. It has no concept of time, no concept of logic, and absolutely no concept of morality. It simply demands immediate, absolute gratification of its urges. It is the infant screaming in the middle of the night.
But clearly we can't operate like that. If everyone acted on every single sexual or aggressive impulse the second it arose, society would disintegrate by Tuesday. We need a counterforce, and that is the second structure, the superego.
Freud called this the Über-Ich, or the above me. This is our moral conscience, our internalized sense of societal rules, guilt, and ideals. And the materials provide this wonderfully relatable, almost cinematic example of exactly how the superego is constructed in real time.
It is a perfect illustration. Picture a 2-year-old child wandering around a living room. On a low table, there is a very fragile, very forbidden vase. Over the past few weeks, the parents have repeatedly scolded the child, physically moving them away and sternly saying, no, do not touch the vase.
Now the child is alone in the room. They see the vase. The primitive ich instantly surges up and says, touch it, grab it, smash it on the floor and see what kind of noise it makes. The urge is pure, unadulterated curiosity and aggression.
The child starts walking toward the table. They reach their little hand out toward the porcelain, but then right before making contact, the child suddenly freezes. They pull their hand back, clutch it to their chest, and say out loud to an empty room, no, don't touch vase.
That specific moment is profound. From a developmental standpoint, that is the exact moment of internalization. The external authority figure, the physical parent who used to enforce the rule, has just been successfully downloaded into the child's own mind.
The parent's external voice has become the child's internal conscience. The superego has been born. It will sit on their shoulder for the rest of their life, often speaking in the emotional tone of those early caregivers, constantly evaluating their actions against a rigid moral code.
So now we have a massive problem. The id is screaming, do it, smash the vase, pursue the taboo desire. And the superego is screaming, don't you dare, you are bad, you will be punished, you should feel ashamed. You have 2 absolute extremists screaming at each other inside your head.
Who mediates? Who breaks the tie? That is the job of the third structure, the ego or the I. The ego is the executive decision maker. Its entire existence is dedicated to navigating reality.
It has to find a way to satisfy the primal urges of the I just enough to keep you from going crazy, while appeasing the strict morality of the superego just enough to keep you from being crushed by guilt.
And the tools the ego uses to negotiate these ceasefires are called defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms are essentially psychological shock absorbers. They subtly, or sometimes radically, distort our perception of reality to protect the conscious mind from experiencing unbearable levels of anxiety, shame, or psychic pain.
And it is crucial to understand that we all use them every single day. They aren't inherently pathological. In fact, some of them are the bedrock of human civilization.
Right, like sublimation. Freud considered this the most mature, healthy defense mechanism. Sublimation is when the ego takes a completely unacceptable, raw urge from the id, and instead of repressing it, elegantly channels it into a socially acceptable or even highly productive outlet.
Let's say you have incredibly intense, deep-seated aggressive drives. You want to dominate and physically hurt people. If you act on that, you go to prison. So the ego sublimates it. Maybe you become a professional mixed martial artist where society actually applauds you for your aggression.
Or, on a more everyday level, maybe you become a ruthlessly competitive trial lawyer, or you channel that aggression into fiercely tackling your opponents in a weekend rugby league.
The materials even include a slightly humorous nod to this, suggesting that a man with intense, unacceptable voyeuristic urges might sublimate those desires by becoming a professional wildlife or documentary cameraman. You are satisfying the core biological drive to watch, but you've wrapped it in a socially productive, totally acceptable package.
But the ego's tools aren't always so elegant or healthy. Consider reaction formation. This happens when the ego encounters an impulse or an emotion that the superego deems so fundamentally unacceptable that the conscious mind cannot even acknowledge its existence.
To defend against it, the ego completely inverts the feeling, twisting it into its exact opposite.
Imagine someone goes through a devastating breakup. They feel profoundly rejected, vulnerable, and deeply in love with the person who left them. The pain is intolerable. The ego cannot process the humiliation. So, virtually overnight, the person declares, I never actually cared about them anyway. In fact, I realize now that they absolutely disgust me.
They have transmuted unbearable heartbreak into aggressive disgust to protect their fragile self-esteem.
And closely related to that is projection, which is perhaps one of the most destructive defense mechanisms in human history. This is where the ego takes an impulse or a trait that you unconsciously despise within yourself, completely disowns it, and hurls it outward onto someone else.
The classic psychoanalytic explanation for extreme, virulent homophobia is often rooted in projection. The theory posits that an individual is deeply terrified of their own repressed, unconscious homosexual impulses. Their rigid superego tells them these impulses are a fast track to damnation or social ruin.
So to prove to themselves and to the world that they are pure, they project those desires outward. They aggressively attack the gay community, constantly obsessing over the deviancy of others, because attacking it out there is the only way to avoid facing it in here. The impulse belongs to them, not me.
And this dynamic leads to some incredibly complex and sometimes very public psychological phenomena. The clinical texts provide a really striking structural analysis of how these defenses interact, using the historical archetype of certain extreme anti-vice crusaders or televangelists. Now, we're discussing this strictly as an illustration of psychological compromise formations. We are looking at the mechanics entirely separate from any political or theological debate.
Absolutely. We're just looking at the psychological plumbing. From a psychoanalytic perspective, the working hypothesis regarding an individual who dedicates their entire life to obsessively crusading against pornography and sexual deviance is that they're dealing with a massive internal conflict.
On one side, they possess incredibly strong, insistent sexual impulses from the id. On the other side, they possess a relentlessly punitive, rigid superego that equates any sexual thought with absolute moral failing.
The internal pressure is immense. The id demands engagement with the sexual material. The superego demands absolute purity.
So the ego is trapped in the middle, trying to prevent a total psychological collapse. It has to engineer what Freud called a compromise formation. It has to satisfy both masters simultaneously.
And the compromise it creates is brilliant, even if it is inherently unstable. The individual becomes a public crusader against smut. They take it upon themselves to scour the internet, visit adult bookstores, and gather vast amounts of explicit material so they can present it to their congregation or followers as a warning of the impending moral decay.
Think about what is happening structurally. By engaging in this crusade, the individual is spending hours upon hours actively seeking out, reading, and looking at explicit sexual material. The id's voyeuristic and sexual drives are being thoroughly, consistently satisfied.
But, and here is the genius of the ego's defense, because they are consuming this material Under the explicit conscious mandate of fighting evil, the superego is entirely pacified. In fact, the superego feels righteously triumphant. The person believes they are doing the Lord's work, performing a vital moral service.
The ego has successfully harmonized the deep animal urge of the id with the strict moral code of the superego. It is a perfectly balanced psychological equation.
It's perfectly balanced right up until the psychological energy required to maintain the illusion fails, which is exactly why you occasionally see those tragic, highly public scandals where the crusader is caught engaging in the exact behavior they spent their life condemning. The id eventually overpowers the ego's convoluted defense.
Now, it is important to clarify that psychoanalysis did not freeze in time with Freud's id, ego, and superego. As the 20th century progressed, the field evolved significantly, pivoting from biological drives toward human relationships. This gave rise to object relations theory.
Which is a crucial shift, because not all mental suffering is just about repressing the desire to punch someone or sleep with someone. Object relations theory looked at how we internalize our early caregivers, how we form mental representations or objects of the people around us.
And it helps explain much more profound structural disturbances in personality, such as borderline personality disorder. The source materials use a rather extreme pop culture touchstone to illustrate this. Glenn Close's character in the 1980s thriller Fatal Attraction. It's a dramatized Hollywood version, but it perfectly highlights a primitive defense mechanism known as splitting.
Splitting is a fascinating and agonizing cognitive defense. Most healthy adults can tolerate ambiguity. If a friend cancels dinner plans, you might be annoyed, but you still recognize they are fundamentally a good person who just had a busy day. You can hold good and bad traits in your mind simultaneously. A person utilizing the splitting defense cannot do this. Their mental representations of people are entirely fractured into absolutes, all good or all bad.
So someone with this borderline personality structure meets a new romantic partner. Within 3 days, this new partner is aggressively idealized. They are an absolute flawless angel, the savior who is going to rescue them from all their pain. The positive projection is overwhelming.
But it is incredibly fragile. The moment that partner does something even slightly disappointing, maybe they take too long to text back or they express a differing opinion, the switch flips instantaneously. The all-good object shatters, and it is entirely replaced by an all-bad object.
Suddenly, the partner is not just annoying, they are a total monster, deeply malevolent and actively scheming to abandon or destroy the patient.
The patient projects pure malice onto the other person's motivations. And because they believe the other person is now purely evil, their own rage and retaliation feel completely justified. It is a profoundly painful, chaotic way to experience human relationships, constantly bouncing between worship and absolute hatred.
Sounds exhausting. And the goal of modern psychoanalytic therapy is to gently guide the patient to see these unconscious structures, to help them realize that their intense rage isn't actually about the unreturned text message, but is an echo of an ancient, terrifying fear of abandonment.
But as we prepare to transition to the next major movement in psychology, we have to address the elephant in the room, the massive, glaring criticism of everything we have just discussed. How on earth do you scientifically measure any of this?
You can't. Not in a strict empirical sense. You can't put an ego under a microscope. You can't measure the mass of a repressed memory. And this lack of empirical rigor drove a new generation of empirically minded researchers absolutely crazy. There's a joke in the materials that perfectly captures this mounting frustration with psychoanalysis.
Let's hear it.
A young student walks up to his professor and asks, "Professor, how would you define science?" The professor thinks for a moment and says, "Science is like a man looking for a black cat in a dark room." The student nods and asks, "Okay, then what is philosophy?" The professor replies, "Philosophy is like a man looking for a black cat in a dark room where there is no black cat."
Where there is no black cat, right.
The student thinks about this and finally asks, "Well then, what is psychoanalysis?" And the professor smiles and says, "Psychoanalysis is a man looking for a black cat in a dark room where there is no black cat and finding it anyway."
It's a great joke, and it perfectly encapsulates the skepticism that triggered an absolute revolution in the field. If we connect this to the broader historical picture, we have to remember the context of the early to mid-20th century. Physics, chemistry, and biology were making staggering, world-changing advancements based on hard, observable data.
Psychologists looked at their own field, dominated by Freud's murky, invisible black box of the mind, and felt entirely illegitimate. They wanted psychology to be a hard science. And they realized that you simply cannot build a hard science on unseen ghosts in the machine.
So they threw the ghost out entirely. They went all the way back to the philosophical roots and explicitly rejected Cartesian dualism. René Descartes had argued centuries earlier that humans are composed of two distinct substances, a physical body that operates like a machine and a non-physical mind or soul that thinks and directs the body, the "I think, therefore I am" philosophy.
The behaviorists looked at this dualism and said, no, it is mystical nonsense. There is no separate mind, there is no soul, there is only biology and environment. We are nothing more than complex biological machines, born as completely blank slates, and every single thing we do is entirely programmed by our environment.
This was the birth of behaviorism, championed by heavyweights like Ivan Pavlov, John B. Watson, and eventually B.F. Skinner. Their rallying cry was simple: action over insight. Forget the unconscious. If you can't observe it and measure it, it does not exist.
And this monumental shift in understanding human nature essentially started with dog saliva.
That's right. Ivan Pavlov was not a psychologist. He was a Russian physiologist who won a Nobel Prize for his work on the digestive system. He was running laboratory experiments, surgically measuring the exact amount of saliva dogs produced when fed. Now, Pavlov knew that if you place meat powder in a dog's mouth, the dog will salivate. That is not learned. That is a biological hardwiring. It's an unconditioned reflex. Meat equals drool.
But Pavlov encountered a massive annoyance in his lab. He noticed that the dogs were starting to drool before the meat even arrived. They would drool when they heard the footsteps of the lab assistant coming down the hall.
Or, in the famous paradigm, if a bell happened to ring in the laboratory right before the meat was brought out after a few repetitions, the dogs started producing buckets of saliva just at the sound of the bell alone. The meat wasn't even in the room.
Pavlov realized he hadn't just discovered an annoyance, he had discovered a fundamental mechanism of learning. He called it classical conditioning. A completely neutral stimulus, a random bell, a footstep, had been mentally welded to an ancient biological reflex. The environment had physically rewired the animal's nervous system. The brain had learned that the bell predicted the food.
And while Pavlov discovered it in dogs, it was an American psychologist, John B. Watson, who aggressively applied this theory to human beings. Watson wanted to demolish the psychoanalytic establishment. He wanted to prove that human fears and neuroses are not the result of deep, repressed Oedipal conflicts or unconscious defense mechanisms.
He believed fears are simply mechanical miswirings, conditioned responses stamped into us by our environment. And to prove it, he conducted the famous and highly controversial case of little Albert.
Watson took a healthy, emotionally stable 9-month-old infant, known as little Albert. Watson wanted to see if he could artificially manufacture a phobia in this child. First, he established a baseline. He showed Albert a variety of animals, including a cute, fuzzy white laboratory rat.
Albert showed zero fear. He was curious, he reached out, wanted to play with the rat, and smiled. The white rat was a completely neutral stimulus.
But then Watson changed the parameters. He brought the white rat back out. Little Albert smiled and reached out his little hand to touch the fur, but the exact fraction of a second that Albert's fingers touched the rat, Watson, standing directly behind the baby, took a heavy hammer and violently smashed it against a suspended steel bar. It produced a terrifying, deafening clang right behind the infant's head.
Naturally, the baby was terrified. The loud noise is an unconditioned stimulus that produces an unconditioned reflex of fear and crying. Albert burst into tears. But Watson wasn't done. He waited until the baby calmed down. Then they presented the rat again. Albert reached out. Bang! The hammer hit the steel bar. Albert screamed and cried.
They only had to repeat this pairing a very small number of times. Very quickly, the learning took hold.
Watson didn't need the hammer anymore. Just bringing the white rat into the room caused little Albert to become absolutely hysterical. He would cry, tremble, and try to crawl away as fast as he could. The neutral stimulus of the rat had been perfectly welded to the biological terror of the loud noise. Albert had been classically conditioned to fear the animal.
But the experiment yielded an even more profound discovery, the concept of stimulus generalization. The conditioning didn't stay neatly contained to just that specific rat. Albert's nervous system broadened the threat perimeter. When Watson later brought in a fuzzy white rabbit, Albert screamed, "A white dog!" Pure terror. Watson even put on a fuzzy white Santa Claus mask and leaned over the crib, and the baby reacted with absolute horror.
The implications were staggering for the field of psychology. Watson had proven his point beautifully. Imagine an adult Albert going to a psychoanalyst decades later complaining of a paralyzing, inexplicable phobia of Christmas and Santa Claus. The analyst would spend 5 years on a couch, digging into the man's childhood dreams, searching for repressed trauma involving his father, or a complex reaction formation.
And they would be completely wrong. The fear was simply a mechanical miswiring, a generalized echo of a steel pipe in a laboratory rat when he was an infant. The unconscious narrative was a fiction, the environmental conditioning was the reality.
It is a massive blow to the psychoanalytic ego.
Hmm.
But if we play devil's advocate for a moment, there was a glaring flaw in the pure behaviorist view. The strict behaviorists, like Watson, believed we were absolute blank slates, meaning any stimulus could be conditioned to any reflex with equal ease.
But if that's true, why do humans operate the way we do? Why is it incredibly easy for people to develop intense phobias of snakes or spiders or heights, but almost impossible to develop a phobia of electrical outlets or automobiles, even though outlets and cars kill infinitely more people today than spiders do?
That paradox eventually forced researchers to introduce the concept of evolutionary preparedness. We are not perfectly blank slates. Our evolutionary history has pre-programmed our nervous systems to learn certain associations much faster than others because those associations kept our ancestors alive. There is a brilliant definitive study demonstrating this by researchers Garcia and Kelling, often referred to as the bright, noisy water experiment.
Right. So Garcia and Kelling take a group of laboratory rats. They present the rats with a drinking tube. But this isn't ordinary water. The water is slightly sweetened with saccharin, so it has a distinct taste. And the drinking tube is wired so that the exact moment the rat licks the water, a bright light flashes in their eyes and a loud clicking noise plays in the cage. So every time they take a drink, they are hit with 3 distinct stimuli simultaneously: a sweet taste, a bright light, and a loud noise.
After the rats drink this bright, noisy water, the researchers expose them to a dose of X-ray radiation. The radiation doesn't hurt them immediately, but a few hours later, it causes them to become violently nauseous and physically ill. Now, according to the strict laws of behaviorism, the nausea should be associated equally with all the stimuli present at the time of the action. The rats should learn to fear the taste, the light, and the noise equally.
But when Garcia and Kelling tested the rats later, separating the variables, the results completely shattered the blank slate theory. When they flashed the bright light and played the loud noise, the rats didn't care at all. They showed 0 fear. They would happily drink normal water while the lights flashed and the noises clicked.
But the moment they were offered the sweet-tasting water, even in complete silence and darkness, they absolutely refused to touch it.
Why? Because millions of years of mammalian evolution have prepared the nervous system to instantly link nausea in the gut with something ingested, a taste. If an animal eats a poisonous berry and throws up hours later, it needs to associate the illness with the taste of the berry, not with a random bird that happened to chirp or a lightning flash that happened to occur while it was eating.
We are biologically wired to assume that gut illness is caused by flavor, not by sights or sounds. It proves that while the environment conditions us, our evolutionary hardware dictates the rules of that conditioning.
That covers classical conditioning, learning by association, dealing with involuntary reflexes, but the behaviorist revolution was far from over. Enter B.F. Skinner. Skinner looked at Pavlov and Watson and said, "This is great for explaining why a dog drools or a baby cries, but it doesn't explain the vast majority of human life."
Skinner wanted to explain voluntary behavior. Why do you get out of bed and go to work? Why do you choose to speak in a certain dialect? Why do we develop complex cultures? Skinner's grand theory was operant conditioning, and his central thesis was as simple as it was radical. Voluntary behaviors are entirely selected by their consequences.
It's the ultimate environmental determinism. If an action is followed by a reinforcer, a reward, the probability of you repeating that action increases. If an action is followed by a punisher, the probability decreases. You are essentially a highly complex pinball, bouncing through an environment of rewards and punishments that shape your every move.
And it is absolutely crucial that we take a minute to clearly define the terminology Skinner used, because popular culture gets this wrong constantly. We need to distinguish between negative reinforcement and punishment.
Yes, this is the most common misunderstanding in psychology. By Skinner's definition, a reinforcer, whether positive or negative, always increases the likelihood of a behavior. A positive reinforcer is adding something good to increase a behavior. You give a dog a piece of chicken when it sits, the dog sits more often.
A negative reinforcer is removing something bad or painful to increase a behavior. The materials use the classic example of a rat in a Skinner box with an electrified floor grid. The floor is turned on, delivering a painful shock. The rat is frantic. It runs around and accidentally bumps a lever on the wall. The instant the lever is pressed, the electricity turns off.
The rat experiences sudden relief. The removal of the painful stimulus is the negative reinforcement. It practically guarantees that the next time the floor is electrified, the rat will immediately run to that lever and press it.
In human terms, negative reinforcement governs a huge portion of our lives. You have a splitting headache, so you take an aspirin, the headache goes away. The removal of the pain negatively reinforces the behavior of taking pills. You walk outside on a blistering 100-degree summer day, you get into your car, and you immediately turn on the air conditioning. The blast of cold air removes the aversive heat. Your behavior of turning on the AC is strongly negatively reinforced.
Punishment, on the other hand, is specifically designed to decrease a behavior. Positive punishment is adding something painful, like slapping a hand or yelling. Negative punishment is taking away something good, like taking away a teenager's phone or putting a child in timeout, removing their access to fun.
But punishment, as a tool for shaping behavior, is incredibly tricky, highly inefficient, and often backfires terribly because it requires absolute precision in timing.
The timing is everything. And there is a wonderfully illustrative, if slightly comedic, anecdote in the source material about a cat named Cadbury that perfectly demonstrates the catastrophic pitfalls of poorly timed punishment.
I love this story. So the owner of this cat, Cadbury, lives near a patch of woods. Cadbury has developed a very bad habit of darting out the front door the second it opens and sprinting into the woods to hunt or explore. The owner is terrified the cat will be eaten by a coyote. One evening, the door opens, Cadbury darts out and vanishes into the dark woods. The owner's absolutely furious. He stands out on the back porch for 2 hours, shaking a bag of treats, angrily yelling, "Cadbury, get back here right now! Cadbury, come!"
He's highly agitated. Finally, after hours of waiting, the bushes rustle and Cadbury emerges from the woods. The cat trots across the lawn and walks right up to the owner's feet. The owner, whose adrenaline is still pumping and who is furious about the escape, reaches down, grabs the cat, and gives it a sharp slap on the hindquarters while yelling, "Bad cat, never run away again."
In the owner's conscious human mind, the logic makes perfect sense. He's punishing the act of running away. He wants to decrease the darting out the door behavior. But from a strict behaviorist perspective, the owner has just committed a massive training error. Behaviorism dictates that an animal connects the consequence to the most recent operant behavior it performed.
Exactly. Cadbury the cat lacks the cognitive capacity to connect a slap right now to an action he took 2 hours ago at the front door. What was the absolute most recent behavior Cadbury performed just seconds before the slap? He came when he was called. He approached his owner. The owner literally just aggressively punished the cat for returning home.
The owner is inadvertently conditioning the cat to fear approaching him. It is a profound, everyday lesson in how carelessly humans utilize punishment, especially with children or pets. If you aren't delivering the punisher at the exact, specific millisecond the undesired behavior is occurring, you are actively modifying the wrong behavior entirely.
But if you actually understand these tools and use them with precision, the results are staggering. You can teach animals and humans incredibly complex sequences of actions using techniques like shaping and chaining. Shaping is the process of rewarding small, incremental approximations of the final goal. The source material gives a great example of a tennis instructor. The instructor has a student who has a terrible, entrenched habit of jumping wildly in the air right at the moment they swing for a serve, completely ruining their power.
If the instructor simply waited for the student to perform a completely flawless professional-level serve before offering a word of praise, the student would never be rewarded, and the behavior would never change. So the instructor shapes it. For the first 10 minutes, she ignores the terrible swing entirely. She only watches the student's feet. The moment the student manages to swing while keeping just one foot planted on the ground, the instructor yells, "Yes, great job." She reinforces the first small step.
Once the foot planting is solidly conditioned, she stops rewarding just that. She raises the criteria. Now, she only rewards the student if the foot is planted and the knees are slightly bent. She systematically shapes the raw clay of the behavior step by step.
And once you have shaped individual behaviors, you can link them together through chaining. The speaker in the lectures tells a hilarious story about how his brother used chaining to train a cat to be a living alarm clock. The brother wanted the cat to wake him up every morning, but the cat slept in the basement. So he started by placing a small piece of dry cat food on the bottom step of the basement stairs. The cat learned to go to the first step. Then he moved the food to the middle of the stairs, then the top. He linked the behaviors. Then he put the food on the floor next to the bed. Finally, he placed the piece of dry food directly on his own sleeping face.
By meticulously rewarding each individual step in the sequence in reverse order, he built a chain reaction. Eventually, the initial trigger, just the sound of the basement door opening in the morning, would fire off the entire learned sequence. The cat would bolt out of the basement, sprint up the entire flight of stairs, run into the bedroom, jump onto the mattress, and begin aggressively licking the sleeping brother's face to find the food.
It looks like the cat is making a complex, intelligent choice to wake the brother up. But the behaviorist argues it is nothing more than a sequence of mathematically conditioned reflexes, a chain of dominoes falling exactly as they were arranged.
It's undeniably brilliant methodology. And Skinner was so fiercely committed to this paradigm that he wrote entire books arguing that all human life, our culture, our economic systems, our art, our feelings of love, was just an incredibly elaborate web of operant conditioning. He argued that human free will is a total illusion. We are just pigeons in a very large, very complex box, responding to invisible schedules of reinforcement. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the behaviorists, in their zeal for absolute observable control, missed something incredibly obvious, something that eventually caused their entire rigid paradigm to fracture and collapse. They forgot that animals, and especially human beings, actually think.
They completely ignored the internal life. Behaviorism treated the mind as an irrelevant black box. The rule was, stimulus goes in, behavior comes out, whatever happens in the middle is unscientific and doesn't matter. But as the decades passed, massive anomalies started showing up in the laboratories that operant conditioning simply could not explain. The cracks in the foundation started with a researcher named Edward Tolman. Tolman ran a classic maze experiment with rats, but with a twist. He put a group of rats into a complex maze, but he didn't put any food or reinforcement at the end. For several days, he just let the rats wander around aimlessly.
Now, according to strict behaviorism, because there was no reinforcement, no food, no reward, the rats were learning absolutely nothing. Their maze-running behavior shouldn't improve at all.
Right. But then, on the critical test day, Tolman placed a large reward of food at the very end of the maze. He took those same rats, who had supposedly learned nothing, and placed them at the start. Instead of wandering randomly, the rats immediately, efficiently, ran the most direct route to the end of the maze without making any errors. They ran it just as fast as rats who had been rewarded every single day.
Which completely defies Skinner's laws.
It destroyed them. Tolman proved the rats had been engaging in what he called latent learning. During those early days of aimless wandering, they weren't just executing random motor reflexes. Their brains were actively constructing a cognitive map of the maze. They were building an internal spatial representation of their environment. They just didn't have any motivation to use the map until the food appeared. This proved that the black box mattered immensely. The mind isn't just a switchboard connecting stimuli to responses. It is an active information processor, constantly gathering data, organizing it, and building representations of reality. This realization effectively birthed the cognitive revolution.
Thinking makes it so. The cognitive psychologist looked at the data and said, it's not just the stimulus and the response that matter, it's the organism's interpretation of the stimulus. It's what you believe about the world. A psychologist named Julian Rotter introduced this vital concept of expectancies, specifically the idea of the locus of control. This perfectly illustrates why two people can face the exact same environment and behave completely differently.
The locus of control refers to where you believe the power in your life resides. Imagine two employees working at the same corporation, facing the exact same difficult project. Employee A has an internal locus of control. They deeply believe that their own hard work, their intelligence, and their effort directly dictate their success. If they crush this project, they believe they will earn the promotion. Employee B has an external locus of control. They believe that success is dictated by outside forces, blind luck, office politics, or the whims of a capricious boss. They believe that no matter how hard they work, the promotion will just go to the boss's nephew anyway.
If both of these employees hit a major roadblock on the project, their behavior will drastically diverge. Employee A will work late, problem solve, and push through because their cognitive expectation is that effort yields results. Employee B will immediately clock out and give up because their cognitive expectation tells them effort is futile. Their behavior isn't being dictated by past reinforcement, it is being entirely driven by their cognitive expectation of the future.
And that cognitive expectation isn't just a matter of career success. It can literally be a matter of physical survival. Which brings us to Martin Seligman's groundbreaking and, frankly, quite grim research on learned helplessness. Seligman was initially running conditioning experiments with dogs. He placed dogs into a specialized cage with an electrified floor grid, similar to the rat experiment we discussed earlier. But there was a cruel twist. For this specific group of dogs, there was no lever to push. There was no escape. The shocks were completely inescapable and unpredictable.
When the shocks first started, the dogs reacted exactly how you'd expect. They barked, they jumped, they frantically ran around the cage trying to find a way out. They fought against the pain. But eventually, after realizing that nothing they did stopped the shocks, their behavior radically changed. They stopped running. They just lay down on the floor, endured the pain, and whimpered. They gave up.
That is tragic, but understandable in that specific context. But the horrifying, world-changing part of the experiment is what happened in the second phase. Seligman took those same dogs and placed them in a new cage. This time, the cage had a small partition in the middle, and the other side of the partition was completely safe, with no electricity. The door was open. When the shocks started in this new cage, all the dog had to do was easily step over the small barrier to reach safety.
But they didn't.
No, they didn't. They didn't even try to escape. The moment the shock started, they simply lay down on the floor and whimpered, taking the pain even though freedom was inches away. They had learned to be helpless. They had internalized a profound, overriding cognitive belief that their actions had zero impact on their environment. The cognitive belief that nothing I do matters completely overrode their basic biological instinct for self-preservation.
And Seligman looked at these dogs lying on the floor, enduring preventable suffering, and realized he was looking at the exact mechanical model for human depression. He applied this theory to human beings and developed the concept of an explanatory style. When adversity strikes, when something bad happens to you, how do you explain it to yourself in your own head? Seligman found that individuals suffering from depression tend to utilize an explanatory style that makes attributions in three highly toxic ways. They interpret failure as internal, global, and stable.
This is a crucial framework to understand. Let's say you give a major sales pitch at work, and the client completely rejects it. If you have a healthy, optimistic, explanatory style, you might attribute the failure externally. The client was just in a terrible mood today. Specifically, I didn't prepare well enough for this particular product line, and unstably, tomorrow's a new day, I'll do better on the next pitch. You protect your core self-esteem.
But a person trapped in a depressive explanatory style processes that exact same failure entirely differently. They don't blame the client, they attribute it internally. I lost the account because I am fundamentally a terrible, unlikable salesperson. They don't view it as a specific failure, they make it global. I am totally incompetent at everything I do. My whole life is a failure. And they don't view it as a temporary setback, they make it stable. I have always been a failure, and I will always be a failure.
That internal, global, and stable triad acts as a cognitive poison. And it's not just a mood disorder. It changes your physical reality. The materials highlight long-term, longitudinal studies showing that people who habitually employ this pessimistic, depressive, explanatory style suffer severe biological consequences. They have measurably weaker immune systems, they contract illnesses more frequently, they recover more slowly from surgery, and they statistically die younger than optimists. The way your mind cognitively interprets a setback literally alters your cellular biology and dictates your lifespan.
Which is the ultimate proof of the power of the mind. The black box is actually the control room. And this cognitive approach expanded beyond just internal expectations into how we learn from others. Albert Bandura looked at the strict behaviorists who claimed you had to personally experience a reward or punishment to learn a behavior. Bandura said, "That's absurd. Human beings don't learn how to drive a car by randomly pressing pedals and waiting to be rewarded or crashing. We learn by watching others." He introduced social learning theory.
And he proved it with the legendary Bobo doll experiment. Bandura brought young children into a lab and had them watch a video of an adult interacting with a large, inflatable Bobo doll. But the adult wasn't playing nicely. The adult was violently attacking the doll, punching it in the face, hitting it with a mallet, throwing it across the room, and yelling aggressive phrases. After watching this video, the children were placed in a room that happened to contain the exact same Bobo doll.
The results were immediate and striking. The children who watched the violent video didn't just play roughly, they mimicked the exact specific aggressive behaviors they had observed. They picked up the mallets, they punched the doll in the face, they yelled the exact same phrases. They had learned complex, violent behaviors instantly, purely through observation, without ever receiving a single pellet of food or a single physical reward.
But Bandura took it further, exploring what he called vicarious conditioning. It's not just that we copy what we see. Our cognitive minds constantly evaluate the consequences of what we see happening to others. This was brilliantly demonstrated in what is often called the Rocky and Johnny study. Children watched a video featuring two adults, Rocky and Johnny. Rocky violently beats up Johnny and steals all of his toys. The crucial element here is that Rocky is completely rewarded for his aggression. At the end of the video, Rocky shoves all the stolen toys into a large sack, throws it over his shoulder, and practically skips away singing happily, completely victorious. The aggression pays off handsomely.
Later, the children are placed in a playroom full of toys. Unsurprisingly, the children who watched Rocky get rewarded acted far more aggressively with the toys and with each other. But the most revealing moment of the entire study, the moment that perfectly highlights the complex cognitive processing of a human child, involved a little preschool girl. The researcher asked her about the video. The girl clearly articulated her moral understanding. She explicitly told the researcher that she knew what Rocky did was harsh and mean and wrong. Her conscious, cognitive moral compass was fully intact. She knew society frowned upon it.
But then she looked at the researcher and asked, "Do you have a sack?"
Do you have a sack? It is one of the greatest moments in psychological research. Her moral understanding told her it was wrong, but her cognitive observation of the reward system told her it was highly effective. She wanted the toys. The mind is constantly processing, weighing, storing, and organizing all this conflicting data. And to manage this massive influx of information, the cognitive psychologists began charting the architecture of our memory systems. They conceptualized the mind like a computer processing unit. We have short-term memory, or working memory, which is highly limited. The famous rule is the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. We can generally only hold about 7 distinct pieces of information in our active consciousness at one time. That's why traditional phone numbers were designed as 7 digits.
But human beings are incredibly adept at bypassing our own biological limits, using cognitive strategies like chunking. If I ask you to memorize the sequence of letters D, J, S, E, C, N, Y, S, E, you are going to struggle. It's 9 random pieces of data overloading the short-term buffer. But if you are familiar with American finance, your brain automatically chunks those letters into 3 distinct acronyms: DJ for Dow Jones, SEC for Securities and Exchange Commission, and NYSE for New York Stock Exchange. Suddenly, you aren't trying to remember 9 random letters, you're remembering 3 distinct, meaningful concepts. You've instantly freed up massive amounts of cognitive space. The source materials mention a remarkable study of a college student, an avid long-distance runner, who trained himself to temporarily remember a string of 80 random digits simply by chunking them into marathon race times.
It shows how adaptable the software is. But for long-term storage, the brain relies on an even more powerful tool: schemas. Schemas are essentially organized thought patterns, mental blueprints, or frameworks that help us instantly interpret the world. The cognitive revolution proved that we do not record memories like a video camera passively capturing a scene. We actively reconstruct our memories based on our existing schemas. And to illustrate just how completely dependent we are on these frameworks, the materials contain a brilliantly frustrating exercise. I'm going to read a short paragraph. Just listen to this and try to make sense of it. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you're pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many.
If you hear that without any context, it is utterly maddening. It sounds like complete gibberish. The sentences are grammatically correct, but your brain cannot hold on to the meaning. You hear it, and it immediately slides right out of your short-term memory because you have no cognitive framework to hang the information on.
But the moment you're given the schema, the moment I tell you that the title of that paragraph is washing the clothes, instantly, like a magic trick, every single vague sentence snaps into crystal clear focus. Arrange things into groups means sorting lights and darks. Go somewhere else means going to the laundromat. Don't do too many things at once means don't overload the washing machine.
The information didn't change, but your cognitive framework did. You literally cannot understand reality or form a coherent memory without the correct schema activated. And because our memories are reconstructive, constantly being rebuilt by these schemas, they are incredibly fragile and highly susceptible to suggestion. The materials highlight the groundbreaking work of Elizabeth Loftus on eyewitness testimony to prove this terrifying point. Loftus showed subjects a video of a minor traffic accident, 2 cars bumping into each other. Later, she asked the subjects a question to test their memory. For half the group, she asked how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. They gave a moderate speed estimate.
But for the other half of the group, she changed one single verb in the question. She asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other.
That one word, smashed, activated a much more violent, high-speed cognitive schema. And when those subjects reconstructed their memory of the video, they didn't just guess a higher speed, They literally remember the cars going significantly faster than they actually were. Weeks later, those subjects were even more likely to falsely remember seeing broken glass at the scene, even though there was no broken glass in the video. The language activated a schema, and the schema literally overwrote their visual memory. It is a profoundly unsettling reality, particularly for the criminal justice system.
It is terrifying. Our own minds are constantly editing the tape. But understanding all this grand theory, the deep unconscious drives, the conditioned behavioral reflexes, and the fragile cognitive schemas leads us to the ultimate practical application. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because when you compare how a psychoanalyst, a behaviorist, and a cognitive therapist approach treating the exact same psychological problem, it is like watching practitioners from three completely different planets.
It really highlights the fundamental philosophical divide. Let's look at treating a severe, life-altering phobia. The source materials mention a woman who suffered from a paralyzing, debilitating phobia of babies, or consider someone with a profound terror of riding in elevators. If a patient with an elevator phobia walks into the office of a classic psychoanalyst, the analyst does not believe the elevator is the real problem. The elevator is merely a symptom, a symbolic stand-in for a deeper, repressed, unconscious conflict.
Right. The analyst might spend 3 years having the patient lie on a couch, free associating about enclosed spaces, digging into their early childhood relationship with their mother, looking for feelings of being trapped or smothered by parental expectations. The goal is profound, sweeping psychological insight. The belief is that once the unconscious conflict is dragged into the light, the symptom, the fear of the elevator, will naturally wither away.
But a strict behaviorist looks at that entire process and scoffs. The behaviorist says, "We don't care about your mother. We don't care why you are afraid of the elevator. You came into this clinic because you want to be able to ride an elevator without having a panic attack, so let's fix the mechanical behavior." The behaviorist understands that phobias are maintained by avoidance. Every time you walk up to an elevator, feel a spike of anxiety, and choose to take the stairs instead, your brain experiences a massive wave of relief. That relief is negative reinforcement. You are accidentally conditioning yourself to believe that avoiding the elevator is the only way to survive.
So the behaviorist has to break that cycle of avoidance, and they use a technique that sounds absolutely brutal, flooding or in vivo exposure. The therapist takes the patient, walks them into the elevator, hits the button for the top floor, and physically refuses to let them escape. Or, in the case of the woman terrified of babies, they bring her into a room, physically surround her with infants, place a baby in her arms, and make her hold it.
It sounds unethical to the layman. The patient's anxiety will instantly spike to an absolute 10 out of 10. They will feel like they're dying. But the physiological reality of the human nervous system is that the fight-or-flight response requires massive amounts of adrenaline. The adrenal glands simply cannot sustain maximum output indefinitely. If the therapist prevents the patient from fleeing, if they force them to stay in the terrifying situation, eventually, usually within 45 minutes to an hour, the nervous system simply runs out of fuel. The anxiety peaks, plateaus, and then inevitably crashes. The patient habituates. Their brain realizes, I have been in this elevator for an hour, my heart was racing, but I did not die. The environment is actually safe. The conditioned fear response is mechanically extinguished.
But I have to say, as effective as flooding is, it requires a patient who is willing to endure absolute psychological torture for an hour. If a therapist tried to lock me in a room full of spiders, I might just punch the therapist and run. So for the vast majority of people, behaviorists use a much more palatable variation called graded exposure or systematic desensitization. If you have a severe dog phobia, they don't throw you in a kennel full of barking German shepherds on day one. They build a hierarchy.
Right. The first session might just involve the patient sitting in a comfortable chair, doing deep breathing exercises while looking at a cartoon drawing of a dog. Once they can do that with zero anxiety, they move up a step, they look at a photograph of a real dog. A week later, they might stand at the end of a long hallway while the therapist holds a small puppy at the far end. They systematically, incrementally conquer the fear, constantly pairing the anxiety-provoking stimulus with a state of physical relaxation until they are finally petting a large dog. It is slow, methodical, and incredibly effective.
But phobias are relatively simple, single-axis fears. What happens when you are dealing with deep, pervasive emotional suffering, like severe clinical depression? This is where the cognitive therapists step onto the field. Pioneers like Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis looked at depression and completely rejected both the psychoanalytic couch and the behaviorist laboratory. They argue that depression isn't caused by a repressed aid, and it isn't just a learned behavioral reflex from a lack of reinforcement. They proposed that depression is caused entirely by irrational, distorted thoughts.
Beck hypothesized that depressed individuals suffer from systematic errors in logic, that their schemas are warped. He identified several specific cognitive distortions. One of them is arbitrary inference, which is essentially jumping to a massive negative conclusion without any actual evidence to support it. Your boss doesn't say good morning, and you immediately conclude, I am going to be fired by noon, ignoring the fact that the boss is just late and rushing to a meeting. Another distortion is selective abstraction, where you hyper-focus on one single negative detail while completely ignoring all the overwhelming positive context. You get a performance review with 10 glowing compliments and one minor suggestion for improvement, and you obsess entirely over the suggestion, convinced you are a failure.
And the cognitive therapist doesn't just nod and empathize when a patient expresses these thoughts. They actively, aggressively challenge them. They treat the therapy room like a debate stage or a scientific laboratory, and the patient's thoughts are treated as hypotheses that must be rigorously tested. The source materials act out this incredibly relentless, almost combative dialogue between a cognitive therapist and a man whose 20-year marriage has just ended in divorce. The man is completely devastated, deeply depressed. He sits in the chair and says, my wife left me. I am totally unlovable. No one will ever love me again. I am completely worthless.
Now, an analyst would dig into his childhood. A behaviorist would assign him to go to a social mixer to get positive reinforcement. But the cognitive therapist attacks the logic of this statement directly. The therapist says, let's test this hypothesis. You claim that absolutely no one will ever love you again. Is that a factual statement? Have you been loved before? The man says, well, yes, my wife loved me for many years, my previous girlfriend loved me, and my parents loved me.
And the therapist pounces on that. Okay, so the empirical evidence proves you are inherently capable of being loved. You possess lovable traits. Now, you state categorically that there is no one out there for you in the future. Let's examine your sample size. Have you been actively dating in China recently? Have you scoured the population of India? Have you met every single woman in North America? The man admits, of course, that he hasn't. The therapist systematically, relentlessly shatters the catastrophic thought, forcing the man to admit that his sample size is absurdly small and his sweeping global conclusion of being unlovable is totally irrational and unsupported by data.
It is a profound paradigm shift for the patient. And the therapy doesn't end when the session is over. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, relies heavily on active homework. The therapist hands the patient a chart and says, every single time you feel a wave of depression this week, you must pull out this chart. You write down the triggering event. Then you write down the exact automatic negative thought that flashed through your mind. You identify which logical fallacy you just used. Was it arbitrary inference? Was it catastrophizing? And finally, you force yourself to write down a rational, evidence-based replacement thought. They're literally forcing the patient to manually override and rewire their own cognitive schemas through relentless daily practice.
And when you combine the cognitive and the behavioral approaches, you get incredibly powerful integrated protocols. The pinnacle of this practical application highlighted in the deep dive is David Barlow's approach to treating panic attacks and panic disorder. Barlow looked at anxiety and realized it is a complex beast, a hydra with multiple heads. It isn't just one thing. Anxiety has a severe physiological component, a distorted cognitive component, and an avoidant behavioral component. To truly cure a panic disorder, Barlow realized you must decapitate all three heads simultaneously.
The physiological component of a panic attack is often the most terrifying for the patient. When an attack starts, their sympathetic nervous system goes into overdrive. Their heart pounds violently against their ribs, they begin to hyperventilate, and they feel a crushing tightness in their chest. The patient catastrophizes these physical sensations, believing they are having a heart attack or suffocating to death, which only pumps more adrenaline into the system, creating a vicious, escalating cycle of sheer terror.
So Barlow uses classical conditioning to break that cycle. He intentionally triggers those exact terrifying physical symptoms right there in the safety of his office. He engages in interoceptive exposure. He will hand a patient a mask hooked up to a tank of carbon dioxide and make them breathe it in. Carbon dioxide instantly triggers a feeling of breathlessness and suffocation. Or he will make an out-of-shape patient run up and down the clinic stairs until their heart is pounding out of their chest and they are sweating profusely. He physically forces them to experience the exact bodily sensations of a panic attack over and over again until the brain finally habituates and realizes, hey, my heart is racing at 160 beats per minute. I'm gasping for air, but I am not actually dying. The deep primal fear of their own autonomic nervous system is systematically extinguished.
But he doesn't stop there. Simultaneously, he targets the cognitive head of the hydra. A patient with panic disorder might say, if I have a panic attack while I'm giving my presentation at work, everyone will see me fall apart, I will be humiliated, and my career will be ruined. Barlow uses cognitive restructuring to attack that fear. He asks, you've had hundreds of panic attacks over the last year. How many people have actually pulled you aside and said you look like you were falling apart? The patient usually admits, no one. They realize the perceived public catastrophe is purely a cognitive distortion inside their own head. People generally don't notice our internal panic.
And finally, he drops the hammer on the behavioral component. He absolutely forbids the patient from engaging in safety behaviors or avoidance. If the patient usually carries around a bottle of anti-anxiety pills just in case, Barlow makes them throw the pills in the trash. If they avoid driving on the highway because it triggers panic, Barlow makes them drive on the highway every single day. Because he understands that if they run away, if they avoid the trigger, the fear is negatively reinforced and grows stronger. They must confront the environment. It is a brilliant, highly aggressive, multi-pronged attack on the disorder.
And the data shows it is incredibly effective. CBT protocols like Barlow's work fast, the results are measurable, and patients genuinely get their lives back. This raises an important question that the clinical field has been wrestling with for decades. If these highly targeted cognitive and behavioral therapies are so fast, so scientifically rigorous, and so empirically effective, why does psychoanalysis still exist? Why do we still have therapists diving into the murky, unprovable depths of the unconscious, exploring dreams and childhood traumas, if we can just fix the illogical thoughts and reshape the behavior in a few months?
It's the ultimate showdown. And the answer, which we explore in this final section on the quest for integration, is that the cognitive and behavioral approaches, for all their dazzling scientific rigor, have massive glaring blind spots. They focus so intensely on the head, the logic, the data, the observable actions, that they often completely ignore the heart, the deep, irrational, often chaotic desires that actually motivate human beings. The speaker in the source materials points out a phenomenal flaw in Albert Bandura's massive volumes of work on social learning. You could read thousands of pages of Bandura's brilliant theories studying exactly how children learn from observation, and you could literally close the book never knowing that human beings possess a biological sex drive or that we have a dark, twisted, destructive side to our nature.
The cognitive models often portray humans as overly rational, almost robotic information processors who just occasionally make logical errors. It assumes that if we just correct the logical error, the person will act perfectly. But that ignores the reality of human pathology. The source materials highlight this limitation perfectly by looking at research conducted on severely delinquent, violent teenage boys.
Right. Cognitive researchers went into juvenile detention centers to study these violent boys. They put them through cognitive tests and discovered that these boys universally suffer from a specific cognitive distortion known as hostile attribution bias. Their schemas are warped. If a normal kid accidentally bumps into someone in a crowded school hallway, they assume it was an accident. But if someone bumps into one of these delinquent boys, their warped cognitive schema automatically assumes it was an intentional hostile attack, an assertion of dominance that demands a violent response.
So based purely on the cognitive model, the solution seems incredibly straightforward, right? The boy is just making a logical error in his attributions. Therefore, the cognitive therapist's job is to sit the boy down and train him to rethink the attribution. They teach him to pause, evaluate the evidence, and say to himself he didn't mean it, the hallway was just crowded, it was an accident. They try to correct the software bug.
But the psychoanalysts look at that approach and shake their heads because it completely ignores the chilling emotional reality beneath the thought. The source recounts a deeply disturbing group therapy session with some of these violent boys. They weren't just reacting defensively to perceived threats. One of the boys described in vivid detail the absolute thrill, the deep, visceral, emotional joy he experienced when he pinned another boy to the ground, sat heavily on his chest, and pounded his face with his fists until blood violently spurted from his nose.
And that is the crucial missing piece of the puzzle. That boy isn't just misinterpreting a hallway bump because he has bad cognitive data. He wants to misinterpret the bump. He is actively seeking out an excuse to be violent because the act of violence satisfies a deep, dark, sadistic drive within him. It feels good to his primal hatred. Strict cognitive behavioral therapy has almost no framework for dealing with a patient who actively enjoys their pathology. If your theory doesn't acknowledge the existence of hidden primal motives, if you pretend the monster in the basement doesn't exist because you can't measure it on a chart, you end up treating the superficial symptom while completely ignoring the terminal disease.
And the absolute most horrifying, skin-crawling illustration of this limitation in the source materials is the story about a patient undergoing cognitive social skills training. This patient had been in a strict cognitive behavioral treatment program for an entire year, and by every single metric the cognitive therapist used, the patient was a massive success story. The therapist was writing glowing progress reports. The patient was dutifully completing all his homework. He was learning how to maintain appropriate eye contact. He was successfully role-playing normal conversations. He even used behavioral conditioning to quit smoking. On paper, he was totally cured.
He was a model patient. But eventually, this patient was transferred and evaluated by a more psychoanalytically oriented therapist. The new therapist didn't just look at the homework charts. They started asking open-ended questions about the patient's internal life, his fantasies, and his hidden desires. And a very dark, deeply terrifying secret came spilling out.
It turned out that during every single one of those highly successful, perfectly pleasant social skill sessions with the previous cognitive therapist, the patient was sitting there, maintaining perfect eye contact, while internally having elaborate, incredibly detailed, violent fantasies about raping and murdering her.
The new therapist was absolutely stunned. He asked the patient, "You spent a year with this woman. Why didn't you ever mention these fantasies to your previous therapist?" And the patient gave an answer that should chill any purely cognitive practitioner to the bone. He simply replied, "No, she never asked."
She never asked, because her entire theoretical paradigm dictated that only observable behavior and conscious, rational thoughts matter. If you don't believe in the dark, repressed shadows of the unconscious mind, you will never think to shine a flashlight down there. And that brings us to the ultimate conclusion of this historical journey, the desperate quest for integration in the field of psychology.
The expert in the source lectures makes a passionate plea for an end to what they call ideological resistance. For decades, the field has been fragmented by tribalism. The psychoanalysts arrogantly scoff at empirical data and manualized treatments. The behaviorists mock the very idea of internal drives and unconscious meaning. The cognitive therapists think everyone else is just being irrational. But human beings are vastly, overwhelmingly complex creatures. We cannot be reduced to just one of these paradigms.
The ultimate goal of modern psychology, and frankly the only way to truly understand ourselves, has to be an integrated approach. A good practitioner, or even just a thoughtful person trying to understand their own mind, needs to respect that we are deeply driven by unconscious, hidden motives, emotional trauma, and evolutionary biology, exactly as Freud suggested. At the exact same time, we must acknowledge that our daily actions are undeniably shaped, reinforced, and extinguished by observable behavioral conditioning in our environment, just as Skinner mathematically proved. And finally, we must utilize the cognitive reframing techniques of Beck and Ellis to actively correct the conscious, distorted thoughts that maintain our immediate suffering. It isn't a battle of either or, it is an incredibly complex web of all of the above.
It's a synthesis. The mind is not just an iceberg, it's not just a blank slate, and it's not just a computer. It is all three operating simultaneously, often in direct conflict with one another.
It is just incredible to step back and look at the whole messy picture. We've traced the evolution of understanding the mind, starting from a man lying on a couch dreaming about a decaying fish in polluted water, desperately trying to hide his sexual guilt from himself.
So D.F. Skinner, meticulously shaping the pecks of a pigeon in a wooden box to prove that human free will is an illusion.
All the way to Aaron Beck giving a heartbroken, divorced man a clipboard and a homework assignment to chart his logical fallacies. What we are left with is the profound realization that the human mind is a spectacularly chaotic, beautiful blend. We are driven by ancient primal animal drives, we are relentlessly molded by a lifetime of invisible environmental reinforcements, and we navigate our daily reality through a web of highly subjective, fragile, and often wildly flawed cognitive schemas.
It is a remarkably delicate, intricate machine. And simply recognizing all those different gears turning inside of us, realizing that our thoughts are not always facts, that our reactions are often conditioned, and that our motives are sometimes hidden even from ourselves, is the first, most crucial step toward true self-awareness and ultimately real freedom from our own automated programming.
And that brings us to the end of our journey today. But as always on this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something to explore on your own that builds on everything we've talked about over the last hour.
We've spent this entire time discussing how brilliant therapists and historical scientists view the architecture of the mind. But I want you to turn that analytical lens entirely inward. Think about your own daily routine tomorrow. Think about the specific route you drive to work, how you navigate miles of road, make complex turns, and brake for traffic, often without consciously noticing a single mile of it. Think about the sudden, intense rush of anger you feel the exact fraction of a second someone cuts you off in traffic. Think about that one stubborn, annoying bad habit you just cannot seem to break, no matter how much you rationally, consciously want to. Look closely at your life. How much of your current identity, your minute-to-minute existence, your desires and your fears is actually a conscious, deliberate, freely made choice? And how much of it is just an ancient cognitive schema firing in the dark, a classically conditioned reflex echoing from your childhood, or the voice of an internalized parent sitting quietly on your shoulder, silently steering the ship while you blissfully, confidently believe you're the captain?
It is a profound, slightly unnerving question to carry with you into your day.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep challenging your own schemas, and keep exploring the endlessly fascinating machinery of your own mind. We'll see you next time.